Hey everybody, Matt here from Avenue Record Company. Thanks for tuning in. Today I wanted to talk to you about how I mix bass guitar in a hard rock and metal setting. So let's dive right in. The song that I'm working out of today is a cover of Judas Priest's song, You've Got Another Thing Coming. I worked on this song with a band here in town called Beyond the Gray. You should totally check them out. This song has since been released and is available on all streaming platforms. Wherever you listen to music, you can search Beyond the Gray and check this song out. It's a great one. The reason I wanted to use this song is because, like most hard rock and metal songs, it has a ton of guitars. So there's a lot of competition going on between what is roughly 20 plus guitar tracks. And as you can see, I've got two bass tracks, technically one bass track, because they are actually the same thing. They've just been processed very differently. So let me go ahead and play the song for you. We're starting this song at verse 2, and we'll just kind of listen to the mix as a whole, and then we'll go through and deconstruct what I did on bass guitar step by step. So you can hear there's tons of guitars going on, tons of huge chuggy guitars. The drums are enormous. So the bass really had its work cut out for it. So let me solo this bass out for you, and we'll play the bass here and just listen to what it's doing all on its own. So you can hear it's really thick. It's got a lot of low end. It's got a lot of attack. It's really gritty. It's kind of everything it needs to be. So that way, when you're listening to the entire song, you can still pick it out of the mix among all those guitars that are going on. So let's go through. I'm gonna start out by muting this track. I'm gonna deactivate all the processing that we did. And I'm going to mute this track right here, this bass DI, because this is my bass distortion track, and I'll get to that in just a second. So let me make that inactive, just so it's not distracting. Let's go ahead and listen to just the bass guitar. This is a bass amp. We ended up using an amp sound from the Amplitube SVX1 catalog. I think it was the SVT Classic with the 810. So let me pull up my first plugin that I always put on my bass. So as you can see, this first processor I've got is CLA Bass. I know using signature plugins is sometimes not the most fashionable thing to do, but me personally, if a plugin sounds good, I'm going to use it. If it sounds good, it's good, and it'll be in my mix. So what I do whenever I'm mixing bass for hard rock is I almost inevitably reach for CLA Bass. So let me bypass this real quick, and we'll go through it fader by fader here. So you can hear me activating and deactivating these different modules. Obviously, I didn't use anything on this last fader with chorus or spreader or anything like that, but let's go down the line. This first fader is the low end of your bass guitar EQ. I love using the blue EQ on low end because it helps fill out that lower end, low mid area where you kind of get a gap in your mix, because you're digging out low mids on your guitars and you're digging out low mids on your vocals and other instruments to give them clarity, but then you end up losing some of that low mid energy. The sub and the upper are great, but this lower really helps fill that out. This second fader, treble, I love this top end EQ right here because if you play it without it, it can sound really dull, and then you add this cut. You can see I've got the fader all the way up to 10. I love this top end EQ on this. It just really helps it poke through the mix. Next on the list is the compressor fader. You can see I don't have a ton, 1.5. So it's not doing a ton, it's just kind of gluing it together. Adds a little bit of rumble to it, a little bit of fuzz to it, but ultimately it's not doing a whole lot. This sub fader, I love this because it just takes that low end energy and it adds this great sub frequency harmonic content. As you can see, I've got that almost pushed all the way up. And then this distortion fader, this is kind of that last level of shine that this plugin puts on a bass. I'll play it for you. So you can hear it's giving a little more attack to that top end. It's kind of sculpting that bottom end and that low mid. So that's the first module. Now the second module, another Waves plugin that honestly, if you're not using this, you should definitely start. It's called Max Bass. And basically what this does is it repurposes the lower sub content in your bass and moves it to that low end, lower mid range, to where it's not really making that sub content louder. It's just making it more audible by putting it in an area of the sound spectrum that the human ear can hear better. Let me play the track and I will bypass and unbypass this plugin. To me, that is what really helps that bass punch through and still sound clear. And then the last plugin that I've got is this Neutron 3 EQ. I love this EQ because it's so versatile. You can boost, you can cut, you can use it as a dynamic EQ, you can use it as a parallel dynamic EQ. I use it as a finishing EQ a lot of the time when I'm mixing. You can see, I'll unbypass it here. It's not really doing much. I got a brick wall here, just under 30 Hertz. And then I've got this low shelf and I've got the dynamic module set so that way it's not ducking 220 Hertz all the time. What it's doing is it's only ducking it when there's buildup. You will see when I hit play, it is attenuating pretty much all the time, but it attenuates at various degrees depending on where Jim is on the neck playing. So let me play this real quick. So you can see it's not doing a ton. It's just kind of harnessing. It's kind of wrangling in those lower sub frequencies and that low end. So if it starts to build up too much. So as you can see, it's really not doing a ton. It's just wrangling in the low end and the sub frequencies when they become a little too much. So now let's talk about this distortion bass. Let me just mute the amp track and I'll unmute this. I won't turn on any of this processing. I believe this bass track was direct with no amp or anything on it. So let's go through what I did to process this guy. Now, when you're adding distortion to your bass track, you really want to make sure that you're not creating a problem with your low end. So you'll hear what I do with my distortion tracks. You can see I've got the drive up over halfway and then I've got the punish knob engaged. And then here I've got this low cut over halfway. And the reason for that is if you don't do that, your low end can start to become a bit of a train wreck with your other bass track that you're using it in conjunction with. So let me play this real quick and I'll bypass and unbypass this plugin. So you can hear it's doing quite a bit to the tone. Obviously we have tons of distortion going on and it's mangled beyond any sort of use all on its own. I've cut out a bunch of low end as I talked about, but then I've also taken this tone knob and instead of having it right here in the center, I wanted it to have as much attack and as much bite as possible because that's the point of this track. So I turned this tone knob all the way up. You can see with the tone knob in the center, it's still kind of beefy. It's still got some low end grit to it, even with the low cut. The next on the list that I used was the virtual mix rack. And I'll just go through this a little bit. I gave it a ton of compression with this FG Stress. You can see with this SSL EQ, I'm adding here right at 8K, I'm adding 12 decibels. And then again at 1.5, I'm adding another 15. So I am adding tons more top end. Down here on the high pass filter, I ended up rolling it off just above 200 hertz because I was still getting some of that low end through from the decapitator. And then I'm just using trimmer to attenuate the volume so that way our distorted track isn't as loud as our main bass track. So let me bypass this and we'll listen. So as you can see with the additional roll-off and then all this high-end EQ that I'm adding, this bass guitar is essentially useless by itself. But when you couple it with the primary bass track, I'll mute this distortion, play it for you, and then mute and unmute just to show you the impact that it has. You can see the main bass sounds good by itself. There's nothing wrong with that. But then when you unmute the distortion track, that's where you really start getting that grit and that attitude and that presence that you really have to have when you're competing with over 20 guitar tracks. Let me play this song for you again from the chorus, all tracks in, and I will mute and unmute the bass distortion track as we go, and you'll hear it's not really adding any volume. What it's doing is it's adding presence like we talked about, and that grit and that presence and that top end that this track has really helps that bass punch through the mix. So that's it. That is how I mix bass just about every time I'm working with a rock, hard rock, or metal song. You can see that bass distortion track is kind of that final piece of the puzzle that really gets your bass poking through the mix and competing with a lot of guitars, but without making it overbearing or having it dominate your mix. If you're watching this on YouTube, please click the subscribe button. Thanks again, and happy music making.